The night nurse, Julie Chittard Alexander, was shocked that Wallace, whose bedroom was on the same floor, quote, never came to see him or kiss him goodnight or see how he was. Not once. Poor fellow. He would call her name over and over. Wallace, 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 or darling, 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 darling. It was pitiful and pathetic, just so sad, like a lamb calling for its mother. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we're reading another chapter of Traitor King. This chapter is entitled Coming In From the Cold. It sounds like it'll be sort of a comforting little chapter, but it ain't. It just gets worse and worse. And you guys, let me just tell you, I've read ahead. I've read to the end of the book. Chapters don't get less crazy. So, I'm just going to tell you, you guys, he dies in this chapter. But then we go back to revisit some other things that happened before he died. So just because he's going to die in this chapter, don't peace out on me just yet. Just putting that out there. But this is kind of a grim little chapter. As full of details and insights as ever. So sit tight. Before we get started, if you will hit that like button, if you will subscribe, if you aren't subscribed, send to a friend, comment. You guys are always great with the comments. All right, let's go ahead and get started because we have quite a chapter to cover. Now, like I said, this chapter is called Coming In From the Cold. And it starts out this way. Everyone's still alive at this point. The success of their 2 volumes of memoirs, especially in the United States, had led to invitations to write further books. A series in McCall magazine in the summer of 1960 became A Family Album, ghosted by Patrick Kinross, where the Duke ruminated on clothes in the royal family. Clothes had always been of great interest to the Duke. A wardrobe inventory that year included 55 lounge suits, 15 evening suits, and 100 pairs of shoes. And like his wife, he was regularly voted one of the best-dressed people in the world. That's true. No one's ever going to take that away from them. Those people were dressed impeccably all the time. Interestingly, style for men changed because of the Duke. So he might have been, the little man standing at 5'5", but he managed to dress that frame alluringly enough that the wins or not, that's because of him. All sorts of things. The book goes on to describe, it says, clothes expressed his individuality and vanity. And he became a style icon on both sides of the Atlantic, known for his Prince of Wales checks, wide Windsor tie knot, Oxford bags, +4s, Stuart plaid trousers, cummerbund with a dinner jacket, magenta linen dinner jacket, and bright socks. The Duke, often known as the Little Man, stood 5'5", and he maintained the slimness of his youth through careful dieting. One might say anorexia. He favored comfort and free movement, a style referred to as dress soft, and preferred American-style trousers always with a zip, and English-style jackets. So the former were made in New York and the latter in London, in what Wallace called pants across the sea. His jacket waists were uniformly set high to elongate his silhouette, his pockets cut wider on the left side of the trousers to take a cigarette case, and he wore elasticized girdles in his waistbands to preserve the flat appearance of his stomach. Interesting. I should have had one of those on today. One of my students asked me if I was expecting a baby. But his style wasn't the only thing he was known for. Because of the success of his books, it launched them into more and more commercial ventures, which remind me so much of Harry and Meghan. It's ridiculous. They realized the only thing they could trade on was their royal status. And that's the only thing anybody was ever interested in them for because of who they had been, or at least who he'd been. And they were interested in her because of what she had managed to pull him away from. But it all was rooted back into the royal family. And they're constantly finding new ways to make money off of their connection to the royal family. There are contracts for books. One book entitled My Hanoverian Ancestors, to be written by Kenneth Young, and a childhood memoir ghosted by Charles Murphy. Oh, Charles Murphy, get out of here, man. Come on. Well, the latter was to be based on the diaries that he had kept until after the First World War, and the 2,000 letters strung in chronological order on scarlet strings fastened with small brass toggles that he had written to his parents. But he became discouraged after Wallace told him, "Who will want to read about a boyhood as dull as yours? It's a waste of time." This was a part of his life she could not control. Neither book was ever written. She must not have known him very well, because just in the last chapter, he told about many an episode at the dinner table in which his father verbally abused his mother so egregiously that she would walk out of the dining room and the children would follow. I mean, that doesn't exactly sound like a happy home nor a typical situation. And if he had written the story as it was rather than what he thought it should be, probably would have been a very interesting story. Wasn't it Jordan Peterson, I think, said that nobody is actually really boring? That if you think somebody's boring, you just don't know their story yet, but that nobody's boring. And I found that to be very true. If you really ask people the right questions, they'll tell you anything. And you'll find out that there is not one boring person in the world. You just have to know what questions to ask. Well, I guess Wallace didn't know the right question to ask her husband because she thought he'd had a boring life. But how could he? After one night's dinner with that Pope Hennessy guy, he was willing to spill all sorts of family secrets about the tumultuous childhood that he had led. I guess Wallace never cared to ask. So because of Wallace's interfering, the books weren't printed, but there were other ways to make money by exploiting their celebrity. The couple lent their brand name to everything, from cutlery to dress collections. Wallace launched a syndicated pattern service that led the following February to a monthly column in McCall's. All Things Considered is what it was called, ghostwritten by the journalist Etta Wanger, which ran for a year and covered her own experiences in shopping, fashion, and entertaining, and most controversially touched on the royal feud. One of the columns got into it, and she said, "My husband has been punished like a small boy who's been spanked every day of his life for a single transgression. His hurt has run very deep." That's really none of her business. Like, why is she talking about that when she's supposed to be talking about shopping, fashion, and entertainment? A bit of a negative turn there, I think. Well, Wallace worked well with Etta Wanger, and they planned a further series of articles. But a Duchess of Windsor etiquette book collapsed when no publisher would come up with the requested $50,000 in advance, which back then was equivalent to $450,000. So, as you can imagine, nobody really cared what Wallace thought about etiquette. I mean, considering the fact that she was just coming off a stint running around with Jimmy Donahue, it had really wrecked her reputation. I think maybe a younger Wallace might have been able to manage it. But the woman that she was now, I don't think anybody wanted to read that etiquette book. As you can imagine, officialdom remained concerned about their judgment and the commercialism of their royal status. How familiar these words are. In June of 1960, Walter Monckton persuaded the Duke not to sign a contract for a TV series in which he would reenact the abdication speech. Well, Monckton managed to get the Duke not to do it that time. But he's going to do it later. Their lives were empty, an endless round of parties, travel, shopping, and golf, as we've stated many a time. At the beginning of January 1961, the Conservative MP asked what the Duke had made of his life. Instead of waiting for Britain to employ him, why does he not employ himself? He's rich, healthy, childless. He spent a quarter of a century treading the social treadmill and traveling to and fro like an animated luggage label, a member of P.G. Woden's Drone Club, an aging birdie. His life is a vacuum deluxe, mink-lined. Well, that's what everybody thought. I mean, not surprisingly. And not to help his cause, out comes another set of German documents, again implicating him in his relationship with the Nazis. But he had a stock reply by this point, and he would come out when somebody would start talking about those documents again. And this is what his stock response was.
It's obvious that these reports were slanted in order to curry favour with Hitler, and thereby they gave a general false impression.
But I mean, I feel pretty certain that the attention of an ex-king who had been expelled from his own country by his own people wasn't exactly like at the top of Hitler's to-do list as far as who he needed on his side. I mean, this person has what does this person have to offer him? Not a country. He didn't have anything with which to bargain with. So for him to come out, and that's his, stock line of, well, everyone was just trying to curry favor with Hitler by saying they had a relationship with me. I don't think Hitler cared about you, David. Do we need to be reminded of the fact that when they came to visit Hitler, he had to be roused from his nap, and when he could finally bestir himself to stagger out, he did after they'd been waiting for like 45 minutes? I mean, it's not exactly like Hitler was, clicking his heels and raising the salute. Anyway, the Duke of Windsor has been attacked in the press for having hobnobbed with Hitler in the late 30s, wrote Noel Coward in his diary on New Year's Eve. Secret papers have disclosed his pro-Nazi perfidy, which, of course, I was perfectly aware of at the time. Poor dear, what a monumental ass he's always been. Nobody's nice about David in their diaries. Like, the diaries are so scathing. You just wonder how he didn't pick up on this in life. And as the chapter will go on, I mean, he's dropping people like flies. I mean, people are just abandoning them. So that by the end of it, it's pathetic. But you could see it all along in everybody's journals, how much everybody despised him or just thought he was stupid. But if he was struggling with his image with the whole Nazi situation. The royal family was trying to extend a hand of friendship to him. And as they extended the olive branch, some people thought that maybe the thaw had come. Maybe the royal family and Wallace and David were going to be brought back into the fold and all could be sort of sorted. Maybe it's not going to be the cozy thing that it could have been, but, maybe peace will come. So at the end of 1964, the Duke traveled to Texas to be operated on for an aneurysm on his aorta, and the Queen sent flowers. 2 months later, the Duke was operated on for a detached retina at the London clinic, and the Queen paid a brief half-hour visit, the first time she'd met Wallace since before the abdication. The Duke's sister Mary also visited, following a few days later by Princess Marina. The Queen Mother went as far as to send flowers. This was all part of a concerted public relations strategy, but it was done reluctantly. According to the writer Greg King, the Queen, however, originally had no intention of visiting her ailing uncle at all. But her private secretary and Monckton's widow did intervene and suggested that it would be a nice idea if she did visit her uncle, so she agreed to go. 10 days later, after her first visit, the Queen had tea with the Duke at his hotel suite in Claridge's and agreed to his request for the couple to be buried at Frogmore. It was during his London visit that Mary and the Duke's sister suddenly died of a coronary thrombosis while still walking with her family in her Yorkshire estate. Her memorial service at the beginning of April was the first public appearance of the Windsors together. They returned to Paris on the royal flight. The following month, Princess Alexandra, on holiday with her husband in Paris, dropped in to see her uncle and his wife. So things are looking up a bit, aren't they? There was a time when no one would even acknowledge that the Duke had had surgery. No one would have even acknowledged him in any way, shape, or form. But every time the royal family tried to repair the relationship, the Windsors jeopardized it. In May of 1965, the New York premiere took place of a documentary based on a King's story, a strange mixture of old newsreels and interviews interspersed with footage of the Duke reciting passages and nervously sitting in the garden with the Duchess. It was made by Jack Levine, who had previously produced a telebiography of Churchill's The Valiant Years, and it was narrated by Orson Welles, and it was calculated to have netted the Duke almost $40,000, which is about $3.5 million today. And for the documentary, the Duke read out the abdication speech. Just why would he do that? You have to ask yourself. And isn't that just what Monckton told him not to do? Monckton just told him not to do that. He was already like, hey man, that's going to look kind of lame. Just don't do that for your own self-preservation. Maybe don't read that out again. Don't remind everybody of what you did. But as soon as he got a second offer, he can't wait to do it. Well, it was for $3.5 million, so I suppose I can reenact the most embarrassing moment of my life. Now, this is when it gets so sad and just horribly commercial that I can barely stand to read it. It's just such a fall from grace. So the strange documentary comes out. And following it, you would think that there might be a nice reception, perhaps at City Hall, something like that. No, the reception afterwards was not held at City Hall, but at the department store Bergdorf Goodman. What? Why? The Duke was increasingly being used to enhance his wife's social and financial ambitions. Where have you heard of that before? At a cocktail party among the main floor, handbag, scarf, and sunglass counters, the Duke stood stoically in a receiving line as hundreds of the well-to-do elbowed each other into the racks of new umbrellas in an effort to greet him, wrote the New York Times. In the end, it was his lot to stand by while the Duchess gave the newspaper interviews, describing her clothes, and drew raffle numbers for men's shoes and sets of Wamsuda super-scale sheets. That's embarrassing! Why is she standing there pulling raffle numbers for men's shoes and sheets and Bergdorf Goodman? He was the king of an empire. And he's standing over there in a rack of umbrellas waiting for you to finish telling the newspaper man who made your dress? Please. It's just so gross. But they would have done anything for more money. And it isn't as though they're, hand to mouth at this point. It's not like they have not but two pennies to rub together wondering, what tomorrow will bring. They are millionaires, multi-millionaires. So why exactly were they willing to demean themselves like this? Pulling out raffle numbers and standing in the middle of the accessory floor while hundreds of, overexcited, well-to-do socialites and just whoever decided to crawl in off the street shakes your hand. I mean, what is this? Then in 1966, for the 30th anniversary of the abdication, the Duke wrote a series of newspaper articles that took his story on from 1936, where he spoke frankly about the bitter relationship with his family. They were published in the New York Daily News and syndicated around the world. Can you imagine how scandalous that would have been? I mean, tongues would be wagging. I mean, if Harry were to do something like that and write a series of articles against his family and all the ways they disappointed him, it would be shocking. But he had never, he was the spare. He wasn't even the king. He was never close to being the king. He was never gonna be the king. And yet everything he does is met with so much shock and indignation. Like, how dare he speak against the royal family? And truly, how dare he? That's his family. But can you imagine the king of the British Empire writing a series of articles, just hanging out his dirty laundry for you to see? Can you imagine how scandalous that would be? I mean, people would not be able to stop talking about it. He also used the pieces to deny
any dealings by me with German or Spanish agents in Lisbon.
They did nothing to improve his relationship with the royal family. In June of 1967, the Queen invited the couple to attend the dedication of a plaque outside Marlborough House, commemorating Queen Mary. The Queen Mother was adamant that if Wallis was invited, she would not attend. The Duke said that he would not attend if Wallis was not invited. Eventually, the Queen Mother relented, and for the first time since 1936, the two women met. Well, it's time to get back to England. They're in the U.S. at the time, and they need to sail back to England. Usually, they would have come on the Queen Mary, but not this time. Not this time, because this time they're going to come on the SS United States because they've been given reduced price suite in return for attending some functions and posing for the ship's photographer and, holding a short press conference. But, it's all in the effort to save a couple of pennies. But they don't need to. They don't need to exploit themselves like this. Were they getting to sail on this ship for free? And even if they were, even if it was like, between paying to be on the Queen Mary and sailing for free on a ship, which it wasn't free, it was just reduced price. But even what if it had been free? Don't take that deal. Have some dignity and respect. It's just like quit trading off your name all day long. But if you aren't going to get legitimate work, I guess that's what you have to do because the coffers are going to run dry at some point. So out the window goes your dignity. If you even had any left after standing there in a department store calling raffle numbers, at this point, what difference does it make? Well, they get there and a crowd of 5,000 people had gathered to witness the historic meeting. The Windsor's arrival was met with cheers and the Queen Mother kissed the Duke on the cheek, though the Duchess refused to curtsy to her sister-in-law. How in the world could she be so tacky that you're finally here, Wallis, let's have some manners. I thought you wanted to write an etiquette book. I don't think this is going to pass the sniff test. If you're standing in front of royalty, the Queen Mother, you should curtsy. Have you ever seen that reel of Princess Diana? She curtsied to everybody. Was there a person that poor girl didn't curtsy to? But Wallis cannot, manage to just take a quick dip, Anyway, things were polite. Everyone shook hands, talked briefly after the ceremony, which it only lasted 15 minutes. Afterwards, a small lunch was hosted for them by Princess Marina at Kensington Palace, while the Queen, Prince Philip, and the Queen Mother and the Duchess of Gloucester left to watch the Derby at Epsom. The court circular the next day mentioned every royal, except the Windsors. But they're not royal anymore, because they've left. So why should the court circular bother to name them? Suppose they're called the Duke and Duchess, so maybe they are considered royal. But can you really be royal when you've been exiled by your country? Are you still royal at that point if you can't do anything and you're never invited anywhere? Are you still royal? I don't know. Though the Duke was invited to the investiture of Prince Charles, he chose not to go, as Wallis was not asked. Nor, though invited, had the Duke attended the dedication of the King George VI Memorial Chapel at St. George's Chapel a few months earlier. If she doesn't get invited, he's not coming. But at a certain point, I get what he's saying. It is his wife. And that's what I'm kind of, what I don't like. Hot take here, friends. I think the royal family needed to just chill out already with this whole Wallis can't come around. Because it is what it is. He's been exiled. It's been years and years and years and years since it actually happened. We have a whole nother queen here. She has children. She's well established in the role. He's not going to come take it. He's old. He's sad. He's pathetic. At a certain point, this man married this woman. It's not just somebody he's shacking up with. It's not like someone he kind of knows. This is the woman he's chosen to marry. And it is rude to extend an invitation to one of the spouses, but not the other. That's kind of like the height of rudeness. So if he was offended by that, I say, yeah, you should be offended. That's an offensive gesture. It seems to me that the royal family that is so certain of the right things to do and so often does the right thing, it surprises me that they are so insistent on this bit of rudeness. I think that anybody looking on would say, hey, you have every right to be upset about whatever it is that David did. But if you're going to invite David, you have to invite Wallace. You can't just keep rubbing salt in the wound. Just don't invite them. But it's stupid to just invite him because you know that this is a pain point for him. It upsets him every time that she doesn't get to come. So if you know that and you don't want her to come, just don't invite either one of them. And if you want to just get, past yourselves and just let her come, then just let her come. It's not like anybody has to hang out with them for hours. Keep it short. It was a 15-minute meeting. Did it kill anybody? No. That's just what I think. I just think it kind of dragged on a little bit. I mean, we're now in the 1970s and we're still being like, not Wallace. It's like, what is that old hag going to do now? I mean, she's no threat. Well, at this point, like I said, it's 1970. The Windsors were interviewed for the BBC on an episode watched by 11 million people. The interview conducted by Kenneth Harris was in two parts. The first with the couple was dominated by Wallace, the Duke in an oversized gray suit shifting nervously, his eyes averted from the camera, constantly looking to Wallace for assurance. Asked if she had any regrets, Wallace replied, "Oh, about certain things, yes. I wish it could have been different. I mean, I'm extremely happy. We've had some hard times, but who hasn't? Some of us just have to learn to live with that." The second part was with only the Duke, and there he was more confident, claiming to have had no regrets about the abdication, except that he would have liked to reign longer.
"But I was going to do it under my own conditions, so I do not have any regrets. But I take a great interest in my country, which is Britain, your land and mine, and I wish it well."
That's nice. Now, this bit here was really interesting to me because enter on the scene Prince Charles, the now King Charles. And I think this is very interesting. I sort of had forgotten that their lives overlapped at all and that he would have been of age to have had an opinion about them. I forget sometimes how elderly he is. And I don't know how I could forget that. He waited a very long time to become king. Anyway, in October of 1970, Prince Charles, shooting near Paris, made an unexpected visit at the suggestion of the British ambassador, Christopher Soames, who accompanied him. It was not a success, as he wrote in his diary. It's sort of sad. He says, "The whole house reeked of some particularly strong joss sticks. From out of the walls came the muffling sound of scratchy piped music. The Duchess appeared from among a host of most dreadful American guests I've ever seen. The look of incredulity on their faces was a study, and most of them were thoroughly tight. To my belief, I managed to escape to a small sitting room where I was able to have a word with Uncle David by himself. He seemed in very good form, although rather bent and using a stick. One eye was closed most of the time as a result of his cataract operation, but apart from that, his very talkative form and used wide, expansive gestures the whole time, while clutching an enormous cigar. While we were talking, the Duchess kept flitting to and fro like a strange bat. She looked incredible for her age and obviously has had a facelift every day. Consequently, she can't really speak, except for clenching her teeth all the time and not moving any facial muscle. She struck me as a hard woman, totally unsympathetic and somewhat superficial. Very little warmth of the true kind. Only that brilliant hostess type of charm, but without feeling. All that she talked about was whether she would wear a hat the next day. The whole thing seemed so tragic, the existence, the people, the atmosphere, that I was relieved to escape it after 45 minutes and drive round Paris by night." So as you can see, he didn't have a good time. And I think it would have just been, I'm sure he had heard rumors about them his whole life, and I'm sure that at the insistence of the ambassador, he sort of probably jumped at the chance, like, "Ooh, yeah, what is going on? What is going on over there? What are they like? Are they really as troubled and odd and tacky as I've always heard?" And I think he was ready to play right into that idea. But then I also think that if he had met them when they were younger, he might not have been so off-put by them. But at this point, they are strange. Need I remind us of the words of the former friend of theirs who called them odious and strange? And I think that the problem is he met them when they were in very declining health. The book goes on to say that the health of the couple continued to deteriorate. Now in his 70s, the Duke was no longer able to work in his garden, and his arterial sclerosis was affecting the blood supply to his brain, which resulted in memory lapses and a short temper. When asked questions, he would often fail to answer, wrote one biographer. He would forget names, and for long periods he would sit at parties silently staring into space with an absent, melancholy look on his lined face. Once he was found wandering aimlessly in an upstairs hallway of Mrs. Young's house, looking lost. And the thing is, their friends were noticing, too, that their health and their appearance just wasn't what it once had been. "We dined last night at the Windsors," wrote Cyrus Sulzberger in his diary in October 1969. The poor old Duke, terribly frail. His bad left eye seems to half close, and he has such arthritis in his left hip that he limps heavily and uses a cane. He's a tragic little man. The Duchess seems increasingly nervous and sad. She kept telling me during the evening as she looked across at him, "He had everything. He gave it up all for me." But how was Wallis looking these days? Well, there's people to report on that. Wallis, who had had several facelifts and dyed her hair each week, did her best to appear younger than her age, but no one was fooled. The Duchess appeared at the end of the garden vista in a crowd of yapping pug dogs. She seems to have suddenly aged, to have become a little old woman, noted Cecil Beaton when he saw the couple in September 1970. Her figure and legs are as trim as ever, and she's energetic, as she always was, putting servants and things to right. But Wallis had the sad, haunted eyes of the ill. Then, an even greater shock. Amid the barking of the pugs, the Duke of Windsor in a cedar rose-colored velvet golf suit appeared. His walk with a stick makes him into an old man. But they're a happy couple. They're both apt to talk at once, but their attitudes do not clash, and they didn't seem to have any regrets. Some other people who noticed the declining health of the couple was Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. 3 months later, after Cecil Beaton had seen them, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor were invited to dinner by the Duke and Duchess, Burton noting in his diary, "With half a dozen of the most consummate bores in Paris, I don't know their names, but I shall never need to remember them, for I have an idea they are people who only go to the Windsors. And one of them, probably the old Duke, must die very soon, though it is she who is now nearly completely gaga. It was a sad and painful evening, and it needs a long time to write about." They both refer continually to the fact that he was once the king. "And emperor," I said at one point. "And emperor," she repeated after me. "And emperor. We always forget that. And emperor." He is physically falling apart, his left eye completely closed, in a tremendous limp, and he walks with a stick. Her memory's gone completely and then comes back vividly in flashes. The physical appearance was bad, but the actual diagnoses were just as grim. The Duchess was in the early stages of Alzheimer's. In November 1971, the Duke, who had smoked heavily throughout his life, was diagnosed with throat cancer and prescribed daily cobalt therapy. Though the couple were not told, the doctors knew it was only a matter of time. Shortly afterwards, Cecil Beaton saw her. The Duchess of Windsor came in and behaved like a mad Goya. She's more than ever a personality and character, but God, what she looks like! Her face is so pulled up that her mouth stretches from ear to ear. She was galvanized, as if high, her body and arms and hands so thin that one feels she cannot last. This is one of numerous times in which people said that in her later years she seemed like she was on drugs. There was just something about the way she behaved that was very off. And I think that if you were her, you would be driven to it. Because what do you have? You've done all the things that you're supposed to give you the natural high of life. You have everything. You've had all the experiences. And as we'll go on to read in later chapters, she's had every experience you could have. You know, if she was looking to live a hedonistic lifestyle, no holds barred, she had lived it. And what does she have now? So if she turned to drugs in her later years to feel something, I'm not surprised. All right, well, to continue on, who should re-enter the picture but Dickie Mountbatten? Now, if you'll recall, they'd been friends ages ago, but when he wouldn't show up for the wedding of the Duke, their relationship fell to the side. So it'd been 35 years since they'd ever hung out. At the beginning of February 1972, Dickie Mountbatten, in Paris to dub the French version of a 12-part television program based on his career, took the opportunity to see the Duke while Sir Wallis was having a minor operation in Switzerland. He thought the Duke had aged 10 years. The Duke was upset about a film based on his life that was being planned called The Woman I Love, starring Faye Dunaway and Richard Chamberlain, and sought Mountbatten's advice. Mountbatten suggested that the two Windsors be filmed side by side on a sofa reading a statement repudiating the film. Wiser counsels prevailed, and the advice was ignored. It was an opportunity to review the past and patch up friendship that had never fully recovered from the misunderstanding over the wedding, and Mountbatten's acting as his best man. As they parted at midnight, the Duke paused for a final reflection.
There's something I'll bet you don't realize. If I hadn't abdicated, I'd have completed 36 years of my reign by now, longer than even my father or my grandfather.
It was a rare admittance of what might have been. The thing is that though he never spoke of it, regret colored the very way he lived. Did he need to say how much he regretted what he had done? Every part of his life was lived trying to be what he hadn't been, except for the work part. He wasn't too worried about the work part, but the extravagance, the being someone, he never gave that up. A few weeks later, the Duke was admitted to the American hospital in Paris under the name Mr. Smith. How pitiable it all is. Now at the end, except for the Black Sydney, a late imperial acquisition from the Bahamas, they are quite alone among comparative strangers, Charles Murphy wrote to his co-writer Joseph Bryan. The lady made it so. Whatever court there was, she was determined to rule, and now it's made up of mostly the shadows, and the worst of the collaborationists and the robber barons. Before, they were always the center of attention, always throwing the biggest parties, always had their house full of people. Remember, they couldn't stand that one house because you could only seat 26 at the dinner table. But now, where is everybody? And it's just like Richard Burton said, there's a certain set of people that can rely on the Windsors being sort of their like exciting social event. But there's nobody who goes to their house that is of any consequence in any other circle. I think it's just really sad that they've been so reduced because they did used to put on a good show. And a lot of people came, but I think there was a lot of gawkers. I don't think it was a lot of true friends because then they'd all scuttle home and write in their diaries about, oh, they're so stupid and they're so lame and their house is ugly and all of this. I think people felt that David and Wallace deserved every criticism that they received, that they had attained all of this glitz and glamour by fraudulent means, and that they deserved the smile. They deserved the public smiles and the friendliness, but the backbiting behind closed doors. I think people thought that they were somehow getting back at Wallace and David for figuring out a way to live so richly when they, by the world's estimation, didn't deserve to live like that. So the way people got back at them was by sort of being two-faced, exploring and experiencing all that wealth, and then going back and talking to each other about, how stupid it all was. It's all just a little pathetic, isn't it? From everybody's angle. Well, anyway, on May 18th, 1972, the Queen, on a state visit to Paris with Charles and the Duke of Edinburgh, visited the couple for tea. The Duke, who now weighed less than 6 stone, insisted on getting dressed and seeing her. It was a Herculean task and took 4 hours to get him dressed. He was so weak that he had to be given a blood transfusion just to get dressed, and was on a concealed intravenous drip, which he called the damned rigging. The visit lasted only 30 minutes. I mean, you just feel sorry for the old guy, Look at the old geezer trying to get dressed. He's got to get a blood transfusion, takes him 4 hours to get his clothes on. And then, of course, she's only going to stay for 30 minutes. She wouldn't have cared, but he wanted to make the presentation. He'd always looked so nice. And to the very end, self-deluded, because with nurses caring for him 24/7 and the end in sight, he saw an opportunity to reflect on his life. I've spent the best part of my life with her, and I can tell you that nothing I gave up for her equals what she has given me. Happiness, of course, but also meaning. I found her to be utterly without faults, the perfect woman. Oh, well, Jimmy, was that not an issue for you, David? Seems like that was interesting, but maybe that was the perfect woman. Maybe you liked to be cuckolded. Maybe you liked to feel less than. Who can even know? Because he's a complicated man. And he certainly never put down how he really felt in any true meaning in any of his memoirs, or even in any idea of a memoir. I wonder sometimes if he ever kept an actual diary in which he actually told the truth. But very few people actually keep real diaries. Most of us write with the idea that somebody someday will read it, and we never actually tell the truth. But I think that he believed she was the perfect woman, mostly because, as he told somebody later,
the Duchess gave me everything that I lacked from my family. She gave me comfort and love and kindness.
And while I say that in sort of the funny, mocking voice, the truth is she did give him the things his family was so unwilling to give him. The coldness from his mother because he had married the Duchess wasn't new to him. It was just a new reason to dislike him. But I think that there was enough about him that she disliked that it was easy for her to put all her eggs in the basket of that woman, when there was plenty she just didn't like about David. And, I think that that's why she wasn't ever willing to concede the whole Wallace issue, because if she did that, then how is she going to hide her hatred for David? I doubt very much if David's lifestyle, and we've gone into it many times already. We're going to go into it more later. He was not living, he was not living a traditional, chaste sort of lifestyle. There was a lot going on. There was a lot of rumors swirling. And I wonder sometimes if his mother was sort of, very put off by the fact that he seemed to be so wild in comparison to a standard that she would have accepted. And so I just sometimes think that the whole Wallace thing had nothing to do necessarily with her, but just his mother needed a reason to keep him away from her. Well, the darkness has come. The night nurse, Julie Chittard Alexander, was shocked that Wallace, whose bedroom was on the same floor, quote, never came to see him or kiss him goodnight or see how he was. Not once. Poor fellow. He would call her name over and over. Wallace, 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 or darling, 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 darling. It was pitiful and pathetic, just so sad, like a lamb calling for its mother. It's so grim. How could you hear your beloved person down the hall calling for you when your heart is so steely and cold that you just sort of tune it out? And yet, I can't imagine her being able to do anything else. Think of it. She agreed to marry him against her better judgment. And in the marriage, she decided that she was going to take the road of bitterness towards him. So she was always putting him down, always degrading him. She went and had a very public affair that many people knew and saw and witnessed. And she just treated him like dirt under her feet because she was mad at herself for not being able to say, I don't want to marry you. And he's given her every kind of luxury she could ever ask for. He's never told her no about anything. And now the poor man is suffering and dying, and you know how you used and abused him. How could she face him? How could she go into him and see his suffering and know that in life she had not been a comfort to him and that he'd had to lie to himself constantly and say that she was? And I think that looking at him suffering like that, knowing that he had believed his own lies, that you were somehow good for him, to know that you had hated every minute and that you disliked the weakness of his lies to himself. And you disliked the fact that he had begun to believe his own propaganda. You saw it as weakness and pathetic, and you hated him all the more for it. Now, how can you bear to stand and look at him? It doesn't surprise me that she didn't answer the call. I don't think many people under those circumstances could have rallied the moral courage, and the moral courage to go in and face the person that you abused emotionally for decades. At 2:30 a.m. on May 28th, the former King Edward VIII died, though versions of the death vary. According to a close friend of Wallace's, Wallace was called in the middle of the night and rushed to his bedside. I took him in my arms. His blue eyes looked up at me and he started to talk. He could only say darling. Then his eyes closed and he died in my arms. It's an account confirmed by one nurse, Una Shanley, interviewed by biographer George King, who says Wallace was woken and kissed her husband's forehead. My David. Cupping her hands gently round his face, she said, My David, you look so lovely. But John Utter, the couple's secretary, told Arthur Hugo Vickers that the Duchess was asleep when the Duke died, and he had to wake her. Interesting. I believe I take John Utter's account here, only because this is the second person who said that she wouldn't have anything to do with the Duke as he was dying. And of course, her friend, Countess of Romanones, I think that's probably mispronounced, but anyway, her friend was not known as a very reliable source, so I'm sure she would have taken the Duchess's side in all this and said what Wallace wanted her to say. And then, the night nurse, I'm not sure what she's talking about, but it doesn't sound to me like Wallace would have suddenly roused herself to come in and see him at his dying moment. Well, It's good that she did die before him, wrote Cecil Beaton in his diary later that day. What'll happen to her is not of interest. She made no friends. She will have less now. She should live at the Ritz, deaf and a bit gaga. It is sad because age is sad, but her life has not been a commendable one, and she's not worthy of much pity. It's pretty harsh. I don't understand Cecil Beaton's strong dislike for them because it seemed like he darkened their doorstep every chance he got an invitation. Seems like he came all the time just so he could continue to nurse his grudge against them. And then later on, he's going to be like, yeah, she was a good friend to me. You know, she's a nice person, but she's just not of the right ilk to be a royal. And, okay, but I'm just surprised he could even consider her a friend because he's so scathing in everything he says. Here's the thing. I'm not defending David and Wallace for the things that they did. I think they did a lot of really ratty, weird things. But at the same time, I just sort of condemn all these people who would continue to go to their house only so that they could have the latest bit of gossip. It doesn't speak well for these people. Well, of course, the palace was immediately informed, and the Queen and Queen Mary sent telegrams of condolence to the widow. Dickie Mountbatten was asked by the BBC to pay tribute to his former best man. Initially, he refused, but he felt there should be some response from the royal family, and he was happy to provide it. He rang the Queen, who, after considerable thought, had approved, providing that I spoke about him in a balanced way, says Dickie. And Dickie decided to go way overboard. Balance nothing. He said in this little address that he and the Duke, who he says had been his best man, was his best friend all his life. Yet Dickie hadn't seen the Duke in 35 years, so a bit heavily played there. Yeah, I mean, I don't see what the point of that is, but I suppose he had to have something to say. And what are you going to say? I mean, he hadn't seen the guy in ages, so what are you going to come up with to say now? I guess all you can say is, yo, we're best friends. Other tributes were more measured. The Times obituary confirmed itself in the facts, with few references to Wallace, whom it called Mrs. Simpson throughout. That's a little rude. And then Richard Nixon said that the Duke was a man of noble spirit and high ideals, for whom millions of Americans felt deep respect and affection. So that's quite vanilla. Now, on to the funeral. On May 31st, the Duke's body was flown to RAF Benson, where it was met by a Royal Guard of Honor by the Duke and Duchess of Kent, members of the government, and the French ambassador. A band played, mysteriously, just the first 6 bars of the national anthem. I don't know why they wouldn't play the whole thing, but he got 6 bars of it. The coffin, its whole length, covered by flowers from the Duchess, lay overnight in the RAF chapel, with RAF officers keeping a vigil. It bore a simple inscription: His Royal Highness the Prince Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, Duke of Windsor, born 1894, died 1972, King Edward VIII, January 20th to December 11th, 1936. The next day, the body was taken to St. George's Chapel at Windsor, where it lay in state for 2 days while 60,000 mourners filed past. On June 2nd, the Duchess finally arrived. She hadn't been able to rally it in order to travel with his body when he came, but she bestirred herself, and she finally made it. She was accompanied by Grace Dudley, Mary Soames, John Utter, who she just tried to dismiss 10 days before, the Duke's American doctor and a former equerry, Douglas Greenacre. She was met at Heathrow by Mountbatten and driven to stay at Buckingham Palace, the first time she'd been there since a state ball in 1935. She said how extremely nervous she was of having to confront the whole royal family without David to support her, wrote Mountbatten in his diary. She'd only seen them once before, briefly at the unveiling of Queen Mary's memorial at Marlborough House, and then he had been with her. This was going to be very different, and she was really apprehensive. Wallace was particularly worried about Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who she said had never approved of her. But Mountbatten assured her that she is so deeply sorry for you in your present grief and remembers what she felt like when her own husband died. That's what Dickie said, but she was right to be apprehensive. She said later, "They were polite to me, polite and kind, especially the Queen. Royalty's always polite and kind, but they were cold." A former courtier confirms the reaction. The Queen didn't want to have much to do with Wallace. Dinner was given in the Chinese room. With anybody else, it would have been in the Queen's own dining room. She preferred to go down to where Wallace was set up. It was okay. Everybody behaved decently. Charles was there and helpful. But there was certainly no outpouring of love between the Queen and the Duchess of Windsor, or vice versa. The next day was Trooping the Color, and she had been invited to attend, but she declined to. Heavily sedated, Wallace chose to watch on a television from a neighboring building, though a few press pictures captured her at the window, her face gaunt and her eyes sad. Oh, there's a picture there. It's a little creepy, honestly. That evening, Mountbatten and Prince Charles took her to St. George's Chapel to see her husband lying in state after the crowds had gone. Mountbatten later wrote how she stood for a few moments alone, her head bowed in grief. At the end, she stood again looking at the coffin and said in the saddest imaginable voice, "He was my entire life. I can't begin to think what I'm going to do without him. He gave up so much for me, and now he's gone. I had always hoped that I would die before him." Yeah, I'm sure you did, because then you wouldn't have to think about what you'd done when he was here. Prince Charles remembered how she stood alone, a frail, tiny black figure, gazing at the coffin and finally bowing briefly. As we stood, she kept saying, "He gave up so much for so little," pointing at herself with a strange grin. It was her 35th wedding anniversary when he died. It's just so bleak, this whole thing. My goodness gracious. Well, the hour-long funeral took place on the Monday in St. George's Chapel, attended by the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, with Wallace dressed in a simple black dress and coat. Several times during the service, Wallace appeared confused, and the Queen had to help her find her place in the order of service. Clarissa Avon told Cecil Beaton, one of the guests, how the Queen showed a motherly and nanny-like tenderness and kept putting her hand on the Duchess's arm and glove. "Wonderful as the service was, I was not moved by the death of the man who, for less than a year, had been our king," wrote Beaton in his diary. "History will make his love story into a romance. In fact, for us so close, it's hard to see that. Wallace has been a good friend to me. I like her. She's a good friend to all her friends. There's no malice in her. There's nothing dislikable. She's just not of the degree that has reason to be around the throne." After the service, there was a lunch for 40 in the state dining room. "I was seated with the sun shining in my eyes," Wallace told a friend. "I was in pain from it. I sat next to the Duke of Edinburgh, who I had always imagined would be better, kinder, perhaps more human than the others. But, he's just a flower flesher. Not he or anyone else offered me any solitude or sympathy whatsoever." What are you talking about, Wallace? What about the Queen sitting there beside you as you're confused because your Alzheimer's is kicking in and you can't keep track of what's going on in the service? And the Queen with the, quote, nanny-like tenderness keeps you on track, pointing out the place in the order of service, making sure you're okay. What are you talking about? No one gave me any sympathy whatsoever. The Queen saw you were confused and old and needed help, and she took the chance to help you. Oh, always the victim. After the lunch, the party moved to the committal at Frogmore and burial at a site the Duke had chosen, near where he had played as a boy, and where it had been agreed Wallace would also be buried. The Duchess was shocked by how little space was left for her, just a sliver up against a hedge. I looked at the Archbishop and I said, "I realize that I am a very thin, small woman, but I do not think that even I could fit in that miserable little narrow space of ground next to His Royal Highness's burial plot." Which consequently, they did end up having to take up a hedge to bury her properly. "Oh, I don't see that there's much that can be done about it. You'll fit all right," he replied. The Lord Chamberlain then escorted her party back to the airport, and she left the plane. She thanked the pilot. "You must come out and see us next time you're here. The Duke would so enjoy meeting you." Yeah, she's not long for this world herself. Very sad. Very sad. And the next chapters are only going to highlight how miserable things really are for her now. Without him, I really don't know what her life would be, because up until this point, she could amuse herself to some degree by making a home for him. That's all she ever did. But without him, what is she going to do? She's older now, and she's also very forgetful now, with the Alzheimer's setting in and all. And it's not like she can still run around like she did when she was in her 50s all over New York. I mean, she's getting older. So what is she going to do now? What will her life be? I guess it's going to be her and her dogs and all her trinkets. That's it. She doesn't have anybody. It's just very, very, very sad. And everybody who was watching this show, as the years ticked down, they all saw that this would be the ending. But did she know it was going to be the ending, or did she just not think about it? I'm assuming she just didn't think about it, because if she had, for 1 second, it seems like she would have tried to adjust some things so that in her old age, it wouldn't be so startling and appallingly lonely and frightening to think of that this is what it had all come to. And that and even the memories, I mean, it's like you don't even have your memories at this point. You can't even feast on the memories of the good times because you're losing them. You got the Alzheimer's. So very depressing. All right. Well, I will see you guys back here in a little bit to see the next chapter. The next chapter is called, let me tell you what we have left here. Chapter 23 is called The Duchess Alone. So that's about as grim as you can imagine it being. And then the chapter following right after that is Relationships. That is going to be a very intense chapter. Like, if I thought that other chapter, when I was like, you guys, be careful, don't let little ears hear this, relationships, I'm for real when I tell y'all, don't let the kids listen to that one. So chapter 24, relationships. Then the final chapter is called Traitor King, and it sort of wraps everything up. And that's it. That's what we have. So 3 chapters left, and The Duchess Alone is quite short. Relationships is a lengthy chapter. Well, lengthy and is it really? I don't think so. Okay, I'm just talking and not really making any sense. The Duchess Alone, Relationships, Traitor King, that's what we have left. So there won't be very long episodes. I don't think I'm going to combine any of these chapters because I don't think they combine very well. They're sort of 3 very separate things to discuss. So we'll have a couple of short chapters, which means that I can record them more easily and edit them faster. So I should be able to get to them much sooner. And then, of course, we'll have the Diana book. And then who knows what we'll do after all of that. I really am getting interested in this other royal book that has come out that it's got everyone talking. So probably that one after this. This is what I know. You guys like the royal stuff. I like the royal stuff. I mean, need we veer from what we all love? No. Okay. I'm just prattling on. It's late. I'm tired. So I'll talk to you guys later. I got to get up early. But it was good talking. See you later for the next couple of chapters. Bye.